be too late.
Let's kick it off. Hi, my name is Noel Holmes. I'll be your room host today, so if you have any questions in general other than for the speaker, let me know if you have anything that needs to get worked through. I'll be also handing around the mic at the end to field any questions. Make sure to wait for the mic so the people on Zoom can hear you as well. And speaking of handling Zoom, Marky's on the keyboard. He'll be, and the other technical aspects, he's making sure everything's running smoothly. Our presenter today is Adrian Roselli. From his bio, he is one hoopy fruit who really knows where his towel. And that begs a question for all you strags out there. Hey, you sass that hoopy Adrian Roselli?
Did you improvise?
Yeah.
I feel like you improvised.
I added that last bit.
Nice, yeah. You get the reference.
Yeah.
You get me.
And today he'll be sharing something we can all associate with, and that's Talkin Tables. So without further ado, Adrian.
Thank you.
You bet.
I think it's hilarious to note that this talk is titled Talkin Tables, but there won't be any talking from the presentation, because I'm the one talking about tables, and I really should have qualified that far better. Anyway, I have thrown this slide up. This is my closing slide, and it occurred to me that was dumb. So that was also the wrong word. That was daft of me, so I moved this to the beginning. It's a QR code. The URL is rosel.li/tablesxsu, all is one word. That's rosel.li/tablesxsu. That has links to the stuff I'm talking about. It has articles and information that supports this and some other things. You'll see that it's written as if you've already attended the talk, so just pretend it's not past tense. You can also leave, it's a blog, so you can leave comments or corrections or whatever you see is appropriate to leave as words on my blog. You'd be amazed the things people write there. Okay, jumping to the beginning. So again, welcome to my talk about tables. It says arguably the most boring possible subject matter in all of web development. Yeah, so thanks. How's that for a pre-endorsement? I think that's fair. Anyway, it just happened. It happens that I've been building tables since they were first introduced by Netscape, which I think was through decades of client projects now, and in the prior century/millennium. So I've got a little bit of experience doing them. It means I've accumulated a boatload of opinions. This opening slide shows a dining room with tables and chairs around it, casual setting. It's got a sideboard with a lamp and a bunch of books, and there's shelving with glassware and yet smaller shelves in it, because nesting shelves is also a thing that happens. So I'm going to start with the basics of tables. The image here is a plain pine table with some fabric swatches and a notepad. Yeah, there's a notepad on there. There's nothing fancy here. It's as basic as it gets. It's probably used by somebody to do sewing, some sort of cut up like that. So the tables really have a specific purpose, and that is representing data across two axes. And it's important that a reader can understand the relationships between the data points. So tables use columns and rows to do this. Visually and programmatically, they provide at-a-glance insights. Or at least ideally, it is conceivable your tables can have terrible information in them, in which case it's at-a-glance confusion. If you are using them for key value pairs, you might be using them for the wrong purpose. Generally, a clue that you are doing so is when your table only has 2 rows or 2 columns. That probably means key value pairs might not be the right approach. Definitely do not use tables for layout. I think everybody here is aware of that, so that's not surprising feedback. If you do that, the last century or millennium has called and thinks you misunderstood all its warnings. So, stop. I wanted to add appropriate caveats about HTML email in here, and that would result in me shouting at clouds and asking people to return to plain text email, and that seemed unfair to people who have to support email clients, so I opted not to do that. This talk, to sort of frame it, this talk really only cares about HTML tables. I will mention ARIA table roles in passing simply because they have bugs and they have gaps. So it's worth addressing those. This talk also does not address ARIA grid roles. Those are mostly tables with an inflated ego. And most of the structural concepts that I will be discussing throughout here still apply to those anyway. Okay, simple tables. Simple table is structurally straightforward. Ideally, it gets a caption. HTML has a caption element, so use it, please. It functions well, and it provides context for pretty much all users. You could use ARIA instead of the caption element, but that tells me you hate HTML, and I will judge accordingly. Using ARIA labeled by to point to the visible text still lets a user select it and see it at least, so you do have that as a fallback. That's not awful. ARIA label, however, hides that text from most users and can't be selected and probably won't auto-translate, but that's a general issue I have with ARIA label in general. I said general twice in the same sentence. I didn't even script that wrongness. Generally, a generally bad idea, yeah. Anyway, it's not a WCAG conformance requirement to provide an accessible name for a table. If you exclude it, you won't get failed in an audit unless the reviewer has very strong opinions, and then they end up in the accessibility Slack, and then I end up getting sucked into it, and everybody's unhappy. A simple table uses column headers and or row headers. This makes that two-dimensional relationship I referenced before far easier for users to track as they go. Try to stick with no more than one set of each, though. Do not leave column or row headers blank. So if you have a column header cell or a row header cell, fill it with something. Whether you need to visually hide it later is a separate conversation, but still have something in there. Simple table probably doesn't need a scope attribute. Scope attribute identifies if a header cell is a row or column header, and the browser is actually very good at figuring this out, just like a lot of users are at figuring out what the scope is, so you don't need to add it. If the header cell is the first, if the header cell is in the first row, then it's probably a column header. If it's the first cell in a row, it's probably a row header. The only time you really need to disambiguate these, I just used a word I shouldn't use in polite company, didn't I? The only time you need to clarify which is which and add a scope attribute is in the very first cell of the table, where it could either be the row header or the column header. Because there's potential for it to be confusing, and you should convey that programmatically. You can add a T-head, T-body, and T-foot and col group elements if you want, but they generally don't impact how table content is exposed. If you forget them for a simple table, it won't matter. I've yet to run across a case where their absence causes any issues other than for styling hooks. And a simple table does not, really need to emphasize this, does not span any rows or columns. Every cell belongs to one and only one row or column at a time. That's it, no spanning. That's what defines a simple table. Headers, yes, headers. Put your row headers in the first column and your column headers in the first row. Don't put your column or row headers mid-table. They are often only recognized for cells that follow them in the DOM. So if you have it 3 rows in, all the rows prior to it, all the cells prior to it won't get that affordance. So just make sure they're at the beginning of the table. Don't assign new column or row headers partway into the table. Those are sometimes additive with prior headers, and that gets really complex and verbose and confusing and weird. Very weird, especially for long tables. Don't put your column headers at the end of the table, whether or not you stuff them in a T-head element. Don't put your column headers in a T-foot, no matter where you put them in the table. That's weird. I don't know who told you to do that. That's just weird. It's like putting socks on your head. Anyway, these are common mistakes. I hate them. I've run into them regularly. I've dedicated a whole slide to them because they make me frowny. One last bullet here before I move on to the next slide. There is an ABBR attribute, an abbreviation attribute, and that is not the abbreviation element. It doesn't have real practical support. There are cases where JAWS will support it and expose it, but right now it's probably safest to pretend it doesn't exist. I have filed bugs about this, And I touch on this at the end of the presentation, where I will ask the audience questions, and you will all regret having attended. Now, complex tables. Complex tables also benefit from a caption. They also get column and row headers, column and or row headers. These row and column headers probably still don't need a scope attribute. Use T-head, T-foot, T-body, and col group as you would for a simple table, which means don't, because you're not going to get benefit from them. But where a complex table differs is that at least one cell, and it could potentially be a header cell, spans more than one row and or column. As soon as you start spanning a cell, it is now a complex table. At that point, since spanning a cell could be associated with more than one header cell, you need to provide some guidance to the browser on which one to use. The headers attribute associates spanning cells with a header. That's the simple, quick fix and solution. It also associates more than one header. So if you have cells, if you have a cell that spans multiple headers, you can use this to create that association. You provide a space-separated list of ID refs pointing to the header or headers that you want to associate, and the browser is supposed to expose those in the order provided. Sadly, tables with spanning cells don't work out in real life. Yeah. The headers attribute is largely ignored, period. Pretty straightforward. Adding T-head, T-body, T-foot, and col group have no impact in any of my testing. Always feel free to test on your own. Sometimes I'm wrong, sometimes technologies change and support shifts, sometimes there are regressions. Adding col group and row group values to the scope attribute has no effect either. Whenever you span a data cell, there's a reasonable chance it will be assigned the wrong header. Also potentially hilarious depending on the data that you're trying to convey. Whenever you span a header cell, there's a reasonable chance the cells to which it is assigned via the headers attribute won't have it exposed either. So you might have tried to programmatically associate it, but it might not work. Typically, the browser and screen reader will choose the first header cell that a cell spans, which means you need to test that you need to test the hell out of it. It's that simple. And you need to do it across all the kit that you support. In some cases, JAWS will announce the header as many times as the cell spans. So if a cell spans 3 headers, JAWS may announce its header 3 times. Annoying, verbose, confusing. VoiceOver might simply decline to announce any headers. It may also not let a user navigate all cells in the table, which means it kicks the user out of the table or into a new column after it counters a spanning cell in a prior column. That's a huge problem. If it's any consolation, ARIA doesn't help here. Yay! Yay. There is no ARIA version of the headers attribute, which is part of the challenge here. And other ARIA, such as ARIA labeled by, will override the cell data, so that's right out as well. ARIA described by is also wildly ineffective because it serves a different purpose. And while visually this might be clear to your users, for those who use screen readers or maybe use some automation to test the tables or parse the information, there are going to be plenty of challenges here as well. The simplest advice I have here is just don't span cells. Like, avoid all of this. Don't span, period. If you have no choice, because you can't fire your boss or your client, the vendor, or whomever it is, then you really need to test everything, and you need to do it across every combination that you can muster that might apply to your audience, and then you'll need to document the hell out of it. Because it's going to be a bug, somebody's going to report it. You want to at least be able to say, yes, we know about this, we've chosen to be terrible. That probably shouldn't actually be the verbatim response. Just, I assume attorneys don't like that. Now, this table has books that it's multiple rows and column headers. I've got a bunch of spanning going on here. It has an ISBN header that spans ISBN 10 and ISBN 13 because I'm trying to convey that there are 2 different ISBNs. It also has a formats column header that spans the column headers for paper, audio, and digital formats. And then for extra chaos, I added multiple columns of row headers because I hate users. One set of row headers reflects global regions, and row headers for authors span those. So for example, there are 3 authors in the Europe region, and 1 author spans North America and Africa. Specifically, Nadia Korafor is both Africa and North America. Every screen reader and browser combination that I tested had variations on announcing the wrong headers and breaking table navigation. So don't do this. It's really the simplest thing. And I tried to do a table where at least the content and context could make sense visually, but once programmatically you try to use it, it poops itself. I don't have the best metaphors, I'm sorry. A lot of them are poop related. Were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I might. Maybe totally out of turn. So you're dealing with HTML tables.
Yep.
Are the same issues, do you see the same issues in PDF remediation where tables are concerned? Is that something that touch on later?
I don't have a good way to answer this because I don't spend as much time doing PDF remediation anymore.
Particularly the spans is what I'm.
Yeah, my experience though, years ago when I was forced to do it and loathed myself intently, was it did have problems. I would be uncomfortable telling you how it performs today though. But that said, I wouldn't be surprised if it does this. Question in the front row.
So your mention of voiceover actually brought me back to an issue that I had when I first started my position about 2.5 years ago. I was working through tables with voiceover, and the caption tag, I can't remember, it was either not read at all, or the way it was read was in a very bizarre way. And I'll be honest, I thought that was an error. So I'm not sure if you have any words on that.
My testing with the caption element by default is that it's fine with voiceover, but that's with voiceover in Safari. And I'm sort of hedging my bets here because if you're testing a caption element in a standard table that's got nothing wonky, then there could be factors like CSS. It could be you're testing it in Firefox or Chrome, or there's some other display property. So for example, Safari had an ongoing bug for years where if you attached any display properties to any part of a data structure, a table structure, it would, to reuse my repeated metaphor, poop the bed. All the table structure semantics would be lost. So without having more context for what it was you encountered, it could be any number of those known and existing bugs. All right, moving along. Cell counts. Now let's say that you have somehow figured out how to get your spanning cells to work across all possible platforms in use by your users. You're probably a god. You must be certain that the number of cells per column is the same across every column. And the number of cells per row is the same across every row. I have to call this out because holy crap, you'd be surprised how many people lose count when they're spanning. And there's just extra random, absent, or cells just sitting there, doing their thing, being weird. So the span count of spanning cells contributes to this. A cell that spans 3 columns is counted as 3 toward the total count. If that count is off, then your column and row header associations will also fall apart. Table navigation will also be a problem for users because things aren't where they're supposed to be. Visually, it can be hard to spot in some tables, and the browser inspector I have found is not always clear. Sometimes it's a liar. So be certain to count any spans and also to test header announcements with a screen reader. All right, I'm going to cover responsive tables now because we've gotten through the basics. You were very patient. None of you has visibly fallen asleep.
Yeah. Visibly.
What the hell? I love how you're sort of managing expectations and where you sense my talk is going. Like, oh, Christ. Okay, I'm going to cover responsive tables, and I'm going to cover 2 flavors of responsive tables. The image that I'm using here is a gate leg table with 1/2 of the table already up with a couple of chairs sitting underneath it, and the other half is folded down against the central pillar of the table. I have this table. It's amazing how often I bump into it when the leaves are down, so just keep it against the wall is my suggestion. Okay, under-engineered. If you've read my blog for any period of time, you probably know I'm a fan of under-engineered solutions to HTML problems. The simplest, in my opinion, under-engineered method to make a responsive table doesn't affect the table code at all. You wrap the table in a generic container element, You add two styles, no JavaScript is needed. And in fact, if JavaScript is involved in this, you might actually need to see a doctor, because there's a larger concern here. But if you were forced to make a complex table, one with spanning cells, then this will at least preserve that effort. Because tables that have spanning stuff that you try to reflow get really interesting and weird. So this under-engineered approach is probably your safest bet. A little bit of code on the screen here. I use the div element. It's already treated as a block in CSS, and it's programmatically generic. But since this container is going to let the user scroll the table, it should be keyboard focusable. Granted, if the nested table has focusable descendants, such as a link or a button, you don't need to do this because the keyboard user can already get into that table, so you could skip this part of the process. If not, though, as of now, Safari is the last holdout that, let me restart this sentence because otherwise it's going to fall out of my head in the wrong order. If you don't do this and you're using Firefox, the scrolling container will become focusable. That's a feature Firefox has had for a while now. Chrome just added it. Well, it added it last year, and then it removed it, and then it added it, and then it removed it. Then it did a trial, and then it removed it, and then it added it, and then had to roll it back, and then it removed it, and now I think it's there. And Safari has shown no interest at all. There's an open bug. Nobody's commented on it. It will die. So you still need to consider doing the thing where you make it focusable. Anyway, that means you need to give it a tab index attribute in order to satisfy WCAG 211 keyboard. Once it can be focused, though, it needs an appropriate role and an accessible name. Otherwise, you're going to run the risk of blowing up SC412 name role value, because now you've got something that has focus, and to a screen reader user, they're like, what the hell are you doing? What is this? So I use the region role equals region, because it's a generic landmark. And then for the accessible name, I've referenced the caption specifically by doing aria labeled by. I had mentioned before that's pre-existing visible text that the user can select and would auto-translate in an ideal scenario. And then for the CSS, I make a CSS selector that sets the wrapper to overflow, allowing the scrolling effect. This satisfies SC1410 reflow. And my CSS selector specifically looks for the region role, the aria labeled by attribute, and the tab index. If those aren't there, by using all three, I'm ensuring that the table won't scroll unless you've marked it up to support the other WCAG SCs. And this way it works for keyboard users without creating a confusing tab stop for everybody. This also makes it easier to spot when developing it. So if you don't do this, then your table won't scroll, and then you'll know something's wrong. And it's wrong because you're using, the reason that it works is because you're using CSS to enforce those affordances that you're coding into it. I'm a big fan of doing that. I also make a focus version of the selector, which is that second one. This satisfies WCAG SC 247 focus visible and lets the user know where focus is landed, because that's not a thing that typically gets focus. And then, because I want to meet SC 1411, non-text contrast, I just make sure I've chosen a color that has a 3:1 contrast ratio with the content background. And I use the outline property intentionally so it'll be visible in Windows high contrast mode, or forced colors mode, or contrast themes, whatever the kids call it today. I don't know, it's weird. You probably don't want to set a forced colors style though, because Windows maps that to a system color automatically. All right, the next slide has a little bit of motion. If motion is not your thing, look at my feet. You can't, there's a lectern, never mind, just don't look. So is it gonna move? It's going to make a liar of me? There we go. So back in 2012, Leah Veru created styles for vertical scrolling shadows. And Chen Weijing adopted them for horizontal use. She adapted them in 2018. So for browsers that hide scroll bars by default, this is a good visual cue that some content is hidden. If you use these for non-right to left languages, wow. You may want to swap them, or you might want to add some sort of language or direction selector to do that swap for you. Now, you may have noticed where that arrow is pointing, the shadows are very subtle. And the idea there is I want them to be subtle enough that it doesn't hide the text, but also the video compression might have eaten them, because and they're projected on a wall. And I did have them swishing as I scrolled back and forth. I don't know. I was very proud of the swishing effect. Okay. I thought it was cool. Okay, now, I had mentioned there were two methods. There was the under-engineered, and for the over-engineered method, we're going to, this is a scenario where you're probably right to reach for CSS display properties, but probably look at display block before going for flex or grid. One question that you will need to answer is if you remove the column headers, are you keeping those or are you striking them? That's something you need to decide up front, because that's going to impact how you style things. You probably want to at least visually hide your column headers, but you might need to replicate them within the individual cells, depending on the amount and complexity of the data in those headers, because it can get verbose and it can take up a lot of space. The challenge here is how verbose your replicated column headers, how replicated column header content will be for screen reader users. Always a challenge here. The additional challenge, though, is that you cannot simply replicate them using CSS. So if you use CSS-generated content, then that means peppering the column headers. Maybe you're using a data dash attribute. That won't auto-translate. So you've created a limitation, a risk here by using a data attribute. So this is a case where you might need JavaScript in order to achieve this technique. And it can work with tables that have spanning cells, but it's going to require some extra effort on your part to make that clear to users, because spans are wrong. Just to reinforce that where I can. I am not providing a single pile of guidance here, because it depends really on too many factors. Kevin Powell, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's a CSS guy with like a million followers. I guess people know who he is. I don't know. He has a more compelling take on this. He did like an hour-long video based on my original effort from 2017. Check that out, because he's looking at it from a CSS solution approach, and my 2017 effort is a little dated, as a lot of the stuff on my blog is, so you'd want to see how or if that applies. Now, owing to older browser bugs, you might also need to add some duplicative ARIA for each row, cell, and header. And while Safari was the last one to fix these bugs, in October 2023, which is alarmingly recent, which means you're probably still supporting users on those broken browsers, it's recent enough that you'll still need to add the roles whether or not you want to, even if modern browsers aren't struggling with it. Oh, and if your cells have long content that might not wrap well even after you reflow them, you might still want to use the under-engineered approach I talked about before anyway, in addition to what I outline here, because once the viewport gets small enough, you're still going to have the entire reflowed table scroll in a scrolling container anyway, in order for your very long words to fit. Anyway, one thing that I am going to beg you to do is please, in your print styles, and I hope you have print styles, depending on the context, reset this to a standard table layout. Don't go for the reflowed table, just use a standard table layout for the print styles. Okay, there's some movement on the next slide as well. Probably be just as underwhelming as the last one I warned you about. So this video shows me adjusting the width of my example table. It's screeching. You can't even see there's a caption that says screeching. It was funny. At the 7-second mark, you saw that reflow kick in, and it popped a new layout into place. And then I replicate the column headers within each cell. So duplicative content, of course. But I did it as CSS-generated content, which is not the way I would recommend doing it now. I feel bad about that. I learned a valuable lesson there. It was 2017. I think Justin Bieber and Coldplay were in the top 10. Lots of people made terrible decisions then. Okay, moving on to fixed headers. Sometimes a table is just too large to fit in anybody's viewport, no matter how tall or wide their viewport is. In those scenarios, you might want to keep your row and or your column headers visible. The image on this slide isn't a table. It's a wall shelf with a couple of drawers, so I'm pretending it's a table. It's structured content, sure. Below it are a series of hooks. One is holding a red coat, another's a drawstring bag. Somebody's put their longboard up against the wall. I don't know if they take the shelf off and put it on the board and roll it into another room. Good for them. Reusing furniture, I guess. Anyway, the good news about fixed table headers is that it requires no extra ARIA and no JavaScript. Yay, that makes it easy. But you're going to lean on elements and attributes that just a few slides ago I told you to ignore. Look, I'm contradicting myself. That's not uncommon. Because even though they won't do much for users, the benefit here is that they're really good style hooks. And they're not semantically or structurally wrong. So, yay. In this code example, I'm using scope row on my row headers because it makes it easier to grab those with the CSS selector. You could do this with first child or nth child and ignore the scope attribute completely, but it's easier. This tends to make more sense when you're writing it. This is a case where the dev experience doesn't harm the user experience, so probably throw the scopes on there. And then I have position sticky, and that ensures that the cell stays put instead of scrolling out of the viewport. Left 0 makes it anchor to the left side. That is not, did I not include that in there? Oh, right, because it only useful for LTR languages. Instead, you would use the logical property inset inline start. Look at that, I got ahead of myself. Thank you. I know, I feel like I should wear a mask when I say it. Z-index of 1 sets it above the content of the table. If you're already using a z-index, you might just need to choose another value that's appropriate for whatever it is you're coding. I understand z-index 9999999 is popular with the kids and frameworks. Row header border. You might want to add a border to indicate the edge of the header cell when it has scrolled. The CSS border property won't work because it gets hidden once you start to do that scrolling. I used to rely on a background gradient, but there's no logical property for the starting position of a gradient. Limitation there. So I had to replicate that gradient across language directions, which is kind of frustrating. But so now I use CSS generated content with logical property positioning. It's far easier. It's a lot easier to maintain, read. It's more robust, etc. So I give that a border instead of a background color, so it's more likely to automatically pick up system colors as well in case there's a forced colors context. Okay. This is a video. This is a movement as well. Here I'm just showing some left-right scrolling in a table. That's it. You can see the things I was talking about. The border stays there, the row headers stay in place, and now you can ostensibly read the things and get the context. My examples are terrible, and they would flow differently in different contexts. It's just an example. Fixed column headers, you can use t-head here as your sticky element. I had said before you don't need to use t-head. That's okay. If you don't want to use t-head, that's fine. You can still use the th element. You don't even need a scope attribute in this case, since the row header selector already has it if you followed my previous code example. So by excluding it here, you've already made sure you're selecting a different thing, because that one's more specific. You could use top 0. It won't do so well for non-horizontal languages, so I use inset block start 0. Because again, I want to be mindful of internationalization and multilingual users. I set the z-index 2, so it's higher than the other ones. It's a decision you make. And I did it because this is a slide after the row headers slide, so it just lives above the other rows. Otherwise, there could be some weird and unexpected overlaps. This is a video of the up-down scrolling. Pretty straightforward, author, title, year, ISBN, stop as you scroll so that you can still tell which column each data belongs to. If I had the multiple ISBN columns, it could potentially be more useful there. This I have found works well in the context of things like banking applications or data that's incredibly boring and difficult to focus on, and often as a part of your job, which is obviously the most exciting data ever. Now, you can combine these techniques in order to scroll in 2 directions. The risk is that you'll have too much space potentially taken up with both fixed row and column headers for users to see that content. You can end up with a very small space for text, especially if they start to scale the text. So, some caution there. That means you might want to set some max widths on your header cells, or whatever is the appropriate CSS, regardless of language flow. So those max widths can be a combination of viewport units, M's, other relative units, again, whatever is appropriate for the code that you're working on. Be mindful, though, as I said before, of how this will wrap, because once the user increases text size, letter spacing, word spacing, it can fall apart pretty quickly. So maybe consider whether either axis of headers needs to be sticky. Think about that in advance. Being cautious for that would also include testing for conformance with SC 144 resize text and 1412 text spacing. Another video demonstrating a table that's too large for the viewport and has fixed headers on both axes. This could be useful, it could be frustrating. So be thoughtful about how you implement this, test it with your users, test it with your data, real data, not fake data.
Does that,
Oh, there is a question, okay. Microphone for the question, or I can repeat it.
all right, I'm just asking, does that violate the success criteria? I'm only scrolling in one direction.
The question is if it violates overflow for scrolling in one direction. It does not, partially because tables are explicitly exempted by that SC.
Okay.
So your entire page can't scroll in two directions, but tables are a case where it's like, yeah, of course, that's structured in a way they're scrolling in two directions makes sense.
Okay.
Yes?
The previous couple of slides, you mentioned in the borders that you would use RGBA colors because otherwise Windows would use forced colors and will replace it with system colors. Why is it bad? Why are you avoiding this? Could you elaborate, please?
So I didn't specifically say RGBA colors. Where did I go with that? One of the things I was trying to do is note that using the border itself will get overridden by system colors, whereas the other techniques I had used, like background colors and gradients, won't. So if somebody switches to Windows High Contrast Mode, which triggers the Force Colors media query, those colors just wouldn't exist. Those borders, those lines would disappear. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. I have so many slides and I don't even know where they are. Wait, I did this, did that. Okay, here we go. Scroll snap. That's really good advice I have there. Almost definitely no. The challenge with scroll snap in tables is that users often want to compare data across cells. If you have small chunks of data, it might not be a big deal. But if the cells contain a sizable amount of data, then scroll snap can cause the content to be partially hidden by the fixed headers that we've been talking about so far. It also means that it's easier, once you're using scroll snap, it's easier to fail WCAG SC2411 focus not obscured minimum in case those cells have interactive controls, because they just might not be able to sit in the correct position in the viewport for the user to see them, for the user to read all the information, for the user to really access them. This video demonstrates me scrolling up and down in the table with scroll snap. The fixed headers end up hiding the first line of text of each cell. This also makes it particularly difficult to select text from the cell when some of it's hidden, as I tried to do there. Since it's partially obscured by the fixed headers, when I used my mouse to select past what's visible, I ended up getting content from other cells. So let me try to replay that. Okay. What I ended up having to do in this video is a weird mouse dance to scroll it the other way without releasing the mouse button in order to deselect the extra stuff. So I've done enough tests with this to see users struggle with it that it's worth cautioning you. Here's another one. Some mistakes with scroll snap you can spot quickly enough though. This book author takes up too much space, so a keyboard user can never see the book title. That's a pain in the butt. What about if the user has increased text or word spacing though? As I just did there. This video shows that the user can't compare ISBN numbers across columns. Okay, labeling. Unless anybody had any questions before I roll into the next section. I mean, you've all been good about just, throwing questions out. You're all awake. I'm so impressed. You all deserve a gold star. You know, Toy Joy sells little stickers that are orange scented, and I thought about bringing some and just putting one on my shirt and scratching it every now and then to help keep me awake. But then I imagine what it would look like if I'm up here scratching my shirt regularly. I'm like, anyway. For this section, I'm going to talk about labeling. Tables with checkboxes or radios that let you choose an entire row are incredibly common. And that's true with tables that have text fields or buttons. For the most part, labeling these controls is pretty easy. This opening image shows a basic shelving unit, has some boxes on it, and each box has a paper tag on it, and that paper tag has a label that looks like it's handwritten, but this is a popular furniture company. I'm sure that they have a typeface for that. Okay, the label element works in a table. It still provides a larger hit area. Use it. Buttons are self-labeling. Use those. Column and row headers give context. But sometimes a screen reader user in particular is moving through just the fields of the table. And they're tabbing through all of the buttons or all of the checkboxes or all of the fields. At that point, the column and row header context is not exposed as they're moving through the table. Worse, even if it was, it might not be sufficiently unique to identify in which row the user is at the moment. You know, what's the content they're about to affect. Using ARIA labeled by at least allows you to associate controls with the header or with both headers or the control itself, or maybe some more information that lives somewhere else on the page. And because you can build, that's because rather you can build a compound accessible name from multiple ID refs using ARIA labeled by. Just be smart, obviously, in what order you string them together, one that should make sense to the user in that context. Reinforcing my point before, don't use ARIA label unless you want a 253 label and name risk and a guaranteed failure for auto-translation. I will continue to bang that ARIA label gong. Visually hidden text that lives in the table is almost definitely too verbose for regular table use, so be cautious about that as well. Here I have a table of books. The checkbox comes before the author row header. It's in the first column. So it already needs more context, as I described before. The label element does what we want here, handles it for us nicely. If you absolutely have to convey flag, which is the column header for those checkboxes, in that accessible name, then you can use ARIA labeled by to point to the column and the row headers, and now you get a compound accessible name. So it could be flag, or it could be checkbox, flag Miguel de Cervantes. Cool. Now you have enough information. Again, could be too verbose, depending on who your audience is. Similarly, I have the text box using ARIA labeled by, and that's the book author and the column header I've associated with. So column header is claimed by, the book author is Mary Shelley, and now with a compound accessible name, I could have Mary Shelley claimed by input type of text. That's what the user would hear when they put focus on it. The button remove also gets ARIA labeled by. That's the last column, and that points to the author and itself, because you can self-reference with ARIA labeled by. So button remove George Orwell, which frankly I think is a concept we can all get behind in 2025. I'm glad some of you at least caught the, yeah, thank you for listening. And there is a demo on my site. All of these demos are on my site, so you can play around with them, tear them apart, find bugs, report bugs back to me, file them with browser makers, etc. Next section, selecting. A nice thing about using the label element is it also gives users a much larger hit area. I feel like when people start writing tables, they forget the label element exists. Don't know why. Kind of weird. It's also not uncommon for authors to want an entire row to be clickable as an even larger hit area. That makes sense in a lot of contexts. So for this section, I'm going to discuss selecting stuff in tables. The photo here shows four wall-mounted cube shelves. One of them sits significantly higher than the others. I don't know if you've seen Shrek, but it's like the donkey jumping up and down, pick me, pick me, pick me. So the most common way that I've seen for authors to make a clickable row is to put click handlers on the rows themselves. Unfortunately, this means many screen reader users would hear clickable for every cell in the table. It's a weird experience, it's unpleasant. It also makes it easy to forget to provide a control for keyboard users. So maybe don't do that. Don't put click handlers on the rows. Another method that I see more and more often are ARIA grid roles because they're thinking, ARIA grid, I can make the entire row clickable. That makes total sense. But ARIA requires the author to do a lot of extra work now, work that they might not have had to do previously in order to make them function properly and still be conveyed correctly to screen reader users. So if the author uses divs with ARIA grid roles, which I see very frequently now, I can confidently say, very confidently now, that they built it incorrectly. And I'm saying this with this confidence because I've never seen one yet that works correctly. And I've looked at libraries like AG Grid and others, and AG Grid I'm happy to name because they're arguably the worst, who just do it wrong and seem to have no interest in fixing it despite all the bugs I continually file that they dismiss, and I might be bitter. Anyway, CSS can go a long way here to do what it is that you want to do. So I have CSS up here. My approach isn't necessarily the best approach, primarily because it means you cannot select the text. But if you look to the block link styles that Hayden Pickering has created, he uses some JavaScript to get around this by essentially delaying that click. I didn't do that here. That's an extra lift. This is more to give you the idea. Because essentially you're taking your favorite block link styles and you're adapting them to tables. That's all we're doing here. So the row header gets position relative. The label gets CSS generated content to fill the row. Add some focus and hover styles for backgrounds and or outlines. And the only catch is that you need to specify a width for the entire row to be clickable. Kind of annoying. You'll see that I have a 92 viewport width for that. And that's because Safari needs the width to work, because Safari has a long-standing, infuriating, annoying, ongoing, ignored bug. It's years old, I think. Now, you could work around that bug by scripting it and base it on the viewport, or basing it on content, or whatever works for your content and your users in that context. But until Safari fixes that bug it seems to be disinterested in fixing, you'll have to declare the width for this method to work. Frankly, I consider that a pretty minor thing to have to do in order to make rows that are clickable that aren't announced awfully in screen readers. So in this table, I can select multiple rows of books. It's easier to click the book title cell than the checkbox, simply because it's bigger. It's a lot wider. I can also click anywhere on that row in order to toggle the checkboxes. The image that I have here shows a vaguely yellow background and a vague blue, no, it's actually blue, thick blue border as a focus cue and a hover visual cue. Choose styles that are appropriate. Don't choose styles, whatever fits for your audience. I did this to be extra obvious. Oh, that's weird. Now PowerPoint thinks I want to make a sandwich? Okay, expandos. So I want to talk about tables that expand, or expando tables. I've worked with a lot of clients over the years who use tables where individual rows hide yet more rows. I don't know, they don't want to startle users with data, so they just keep stuffing them into more and more hidden structures. The image here is a black table with no legs, and it's mounted to the wall and it is folded down. There's a hinge visible up against the wall because the table can fold up, and I guess at that point it can do table things. It could set a mug on it. I don't know. What do tables usually do in the real world? Just put things on the floor.
Hit people.
What's that?
Hit people.
Oh. I like that. I like that you're speaking to my experience with that. I feel heard. Okay, expando basics. First, you'll need a bunch of hidden rows, and those rows will need to match the rest of the table structure, specifically the column structure, and those would each have the hidden attribute. Then you need a disclosure widget. Specifically, you'll need the disclosure widget trigger. And the way I do it is a button with ARIA expanded, because that's straightforward. It's easy. That code's available. You can add ARIA controls and point to every row that will be displayed, but it's not exposed to the user, so it's just extra noise that doesn't seem to do anything, so yeah, whatever. And that disclosure widget trigger works by removing the hidden attribute from all the rows that you want to show. And then collapsing the rows is as simple as re-adding the hidden attribute. So I have a sample of a table row here. It might be necessary in this context to create an accessible name that manages the user's expectations for what will happen. For example, you might want to say how many more rows will appear. I'm a big fan of doing that. You'll see that I do a terrible thing with the ARIA label. And I'm only using it here for ease of explaining. It's just a little easier for me to demo this versus have all the extra nodes that I'm going to reference and build that up. The button also has ARIA labeled by that refers to itself and the row header, and the row header is the author's name. So the compound accessible name from this example is 3 more from Mary Shelley. And ostensibly, because it says show, hide, expand, collapse, you'll understand what the function is. Now, this video shows a row for Emma Dorothy Eliza Nevitt Southworth. You'd think I would have practiced her name more. And her book, The Hidden Hand. There's also a disclosure button at the start of the row. And as you saw, potentially activating it revealed more books by Emma. And there are a bunch. Good for Emma. I haven't written that many. Yeah?
Would you give a name to the column with disclosure buttons?
So the question is, would I give a name to the column for disclosure buttons? Yes. And the code's not in front of me right now. I'd have to look, but it's, the column header is probably show, hide, or something like that. Because you're remembering what I said before, always have a text for the column header or the row header, even if you visually hide it. Now, if I'm wrong and you look at my example, then you can call me out and leave a comment on my blog and call me a liar. Okay, Expando Extras. So you can use this to expand more types of content than strictly a set of rows that match the table structure. If you do this, the row or rows, though, will essentially need to span the width of the table. This is a rare case where I say you will need to span, because I have had clients who wanted to expand that table to show yet more tables. Okay, well, now you need to span. But in this case, the spanning is a little bit less dangerous because it's a whole standalone structure within. Just make sure that the content that you're exposing isn't too verbose or too rich, despite what some of my clients have wanted to do. So it's accessible. Doesn't mean a screen reader user likes it. Doesn't mean all users like it. So be cautious with that. And JAWS only fixed a bug with nested tables as of January 2024. So if you're supporting JAWS users who might be using JAWS version from then, you're going to have a bit of a problem there. So broadly, I encourage you to maybe not do this thing I just said you can do. There's risk associated with it. Sortable tables. Yes, let's sort these tables. It's the final section of my talk, by the way. I really should have been tracking the time better, but we're on a journey together, like a road trip. Terrible road trip. This one is the only one that has audio in my video example. I am just going to Wizard of Oz that. It has captions, which will show, but I think this live caption thing is going to hide them, so I'll just explain what's happening. I want to note that I am not going to talk about the sorting process itself, just the controls. I'm not going to get into how you sort data, just how you expose the sort and the controls that do it. The photo here is a shelving unit that has 9 green plastic bins across 3 rows and 3 columns. Each plastic bin can slide out completely from that shelving unit, and it's a great place to store toys or hammers. I don't know what people put in those things. Just leave your hammers on the floor like everybody else, right? Okay, sortable columns. Actually, I should take a drink of water here. Hi. How's everybody doing? Yay. The excitement. It's like Disney. Okay, to clarify things, I'm only going to speak about sortable table columns, and that's because I've never seen sortable rows.
Yeah.
That's actually beyond my human capacity for reasoning. I'm sure you could do it, but also weird. There probably is a use case somewhere. I'm not even running at it, though. So anyway, for ease of styling the cells in the sorted column, the col group and col elements, in fact, prove handy here. The heavy lift of the sorting is performed by JavaScript in this case. For this talk, I'm only focusing on the JavaScript that manipulates the ARIA values. Again, leaving out the sorting process, just manipulating the controls. The ARIA sort property is the thing that's going to do all of the work for us here, and we can use that as a styling hook. As I keep referencing, use your ARIA as a styling hook. Button in the column header is going to be the thing that triggers the sort. I use SVG images for visual sort indicators. I find them easier to style. And because we're at some point time constrained and I don't hate you, we're going to breeze through this at a relatively high level. So the ARIA sort property goes on the TH. It has 4 values. None is the default, meaning it means nothing is sorted. The ARIA spec says if you're using none, just remove the attribute completely. Just strike it, don't even include it. Ascending means the content has sorted ascending, and descending means it has been sorted in descending order. I leave it to you to understand what ascending and descending mean. I just keep pressing the button until it's the way I want it. You'll see that ARIA sort other is an option. We're going to pretend it doesn't exist for a variety of reasons, some of which are technical. I'm just going to skip that. Currently in ARIA, there is the rule or the suggestion is only one column can be sorted at a time. There is some work to remove that restriction, which I will touch on at the end here. And then in my example, I just cycle through descending and ascending with every click of the sorting button, as opposed to having more buttons in the table. And then I remove ARIA sort from a column header when I sort another column. CSS, I like to style the background color of the entire column that has been sorted. You could brute force this by adding a class to every cell in the column. That's wasteful, however. The col element allows you to use CSS to set the background color of every cell in the column instead. Much easier hook. Support for that is very good. You could use JavaScript to set the currently sorted column number using a col nth child selector. But now that we have support for has, which my selector uses, in all modern browsers we have support for the has selector. So skip the JavaScript, just write some slightly redundant CSS. It's one fewer piece of JavaScript you need to have on your page. And then in my CSS, I'm selecting the col element in the position of the sorted column header, and that's because I'm using has on the col group. But you'll need to have as many of these styles as you have columns, so it can feel redundant, but if you're using CSS variables, which are officially called something else, I just can't remember. If you're using CSS variables, this can be a little less painful. If you're using a CSS preprocessor, this is negligible. Here I demonstrate that the column that has been sorted, I demonstrate it with a light yellow background. You can use other styles, you can use other colors. I just like the light yellow because it means warning. You did this thing, pay attention to it. I hate you. Now the button is the only element in the column header for the model that I'm outlining here. The button's accessible name is also the column header. So you're not creating redundant content here. You want to be as brief as possible, as always, but distinctive enough because you want a voice user to be able to select it without having to, war and peace it in order to make it happen. That also means no hidden text if you want a column that is sortable. And then I mentioned before I use SVG for the sort icons. And then I add ARIA hidden true to the SVGs to ensure they're not exposed and that they are not accidentally added to the accessible name / column header. The sort icons are an up chevron and a down chevron, and then when sorted, one of those becomes a filled triangle to indicate the sort direction. The advantage here is that the visual cue doesn't rely on simply a color change. That's good for SC141 use of color. It also means it's far easier to support forced colors mode. Do I have the code for it? I sort of do, yeah. So the reason I like the CSS is because all I have to do is style So the reason I like the SVG is I only need to style an SVG node. That's it. I don't have to swap nodes. I don't have to do anything special. All this can be handled with CSS. As for the layout, I use CSS grid template areas to lay those SVGs out alongside the button text. I use min-max to m-max content on the grid area for that text label. Adjust as you see fit. And I do this so the text doesn't take up half the width of the available space. That would otherwise push the arrows to midway along the width of the button, and you want them to be sort of consistently placed. And then padding inline end logical property accounts for the for non-LTR languages. The sort buttons, the layout there, the icons were scaled at 0.65 m. There's a width for the third column to take up all of that remaining space. The third CSS grid column takes up all that remaining space, and then I use empty CSS generated content to fill that up. This is, again, very high level, and it's probably boring for those of you who aren't playing in CSS. Now, when activating a sort button, by default, not all screen readers will tell the user that anything has happened. NVDA, JAWS, Narrator, and VoiceOver on iPad OS, just VoiceOver on iPad OS versus and all the others, will announce immediately that a thing has sorted and how it has sorted. In a nod to cross-platform consistency, though, VoiceOver on Mac OS does nothing. Because why would you want VoiceOver on iPad OS and VoiceOver on Mac OS to do the same thing? That would be frustrating. TalkBack also fails to announce that anything is sorted. That means you might need to add a live region to announce to the user when sorting has happened. I have a demo on my site linked in that post that allows you to set the live region between polite, assertive, or just turn it off. So you can play around with it sort of as a test case for your scenario. I recommend building the live region support, though, from the start and just being prepared to flip it off. You might find it's too much, but at least it's there, so when you get feedback from users, you flip a bit and you're in good shape. And if you know that nobody will ever visit on a Mac or on an Android phone, skip the live region. Also, that's not the way things work, so you're still going to have to build that live region. Let me see here. Okay. I like Mad Libs because I was born in that era, apparently. If you don't have access to the full suite of browsers and screen readers for testing, I have this Mad Libs tool that might be useful. It shows you how you can assemble a sortable column header and how it might be exposed to users. So you provide information, the type of control, the number of columns, the sort state, the name, etc. And it will give you the HTML that you would write, and it tries to explain how various screen readers would announce it when they encounter it. This is from 2020, though, and I'd like to think it's no longer 100% accurate because it's been 5 years, and I'd like to think things have updated. But broadly, the concepts are still the same. You could adapt it, bring it in for other uses. Am I over time here?
No, everybody's getting out early.
Sorry?
Just get out early.
Okay. Okay, the good news is we're coming toward the end of this thing, and you've all been very patient and should be rewarded for that by listening to me longer.
Maybe their session was boring and they just left.
They just all walked out at once?
Yeah.
Good for them. Thank you for not doing that yet. So I want to wrap this particular session by backing up just a little bit because ARIA says that authors, quote, authors should apply ARIA sort to only one header at a time, end quote. Very specific statement. But there are cases for more than one column to be sorted at a time, and ARIA doesn't explicitly forbid it. So I have an approach and a suggestion, and I have a post that goes into far more detail than this that's linked off my site. But broadly, you need to do this work all in the same control and without adding more noise to the page if you're going to support more than one sortable column. So it can be kind of complex, and this is only a proposal. I rely on live regions and data attributes, but I do not change the accessible name of the button, nor do I change the accessible name of the column header. So in this example, I have this video, and it shows a prototype in use with it has a visible live region just so you can see what it's going to say, which is great because the audio you're not going to hear. And I forgot I have this up here, so I don't actually necessarily need to shout everything. I'll just read what it's saying. So the first time that you choose a column header, it will sort that column descending, and it makes it the first priority. The first time you choose a column header. The second time you choose that column header, that specific column header, it sorts it ascending and makes it the first priority in case it already wasn't the first priority. The third time you choose that column header, it removes the sorting for that particular column. It sets it to be the, what do I have here? Sets the column that was second in priority, in case there was one second priority, to be the first, and adjust all the others down the line. Because we're still trying to do all of this in one control without having a really complex interface. I don't know if this is the right way to do it, but it's the way that I landed on after experimenting and trying it out with users. You might have some opinions. I have a blog post where you can leave comments. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the wrap-up portion of this. Let's see here. So in this video, I'm using tab to demonstrate the column position is still announced even though I am not using table navigation commands. I use visible numbers on the column headers. They will appear across the top to show their sort priority, so visually you have a queue as well. And I also identify every sorted column and its priority in a live region, which means it can get pretty verbose depending on how many columns your table has. This video is going to show it in action. What I will do is sort by each of the first 3 columns and then go back to remove sorting for the first column. And if this doesn't work, if like you watch this video and it doesn't make any sense, it's available on my site. And if it doesn't make sense for you now, that's okay. It might never make sense as a user, or maybe you just need to see it in context. So I'm going to play this. There will be no audio. So I'm on the author column. I activate it, and it says sorted down, gives it priority 1. I go to the next column. It announces sorted down, author descending, priority 2. I hit year, and it says sorted down, author descending, priority 3, title descending, priority 2. If I go back to the title column, and then back to the author column, apparently, and sort that, it'll say sorted up, title descending, priority 3, year descending, priority 2. What I'm broadly trying to do is use the live region to convey to the user what you've just sorted, in which direction you've sorted, and what priority it has relative to all the other sorted columns and what priorities they have. Again, it is verbose, but it seems like a reasonable way to try to convey this. Not necessarily the best way, but it's using the technologies we have and what is currently supported in browsers. And of course, whatever technique you might eventually develop, if you base something on this or try something new, it needs to adapt to user preferences. In this example, the table headers with the sort priority as seen in Windows high contrast mode, which was renamed contrast themes in Windows 11. You can still identify what the sorting icons are and the numbers, regardless of the color that's chosen, because it's no good. It's pointless to build a pattern, a new pattern, if it doesn't work for all of these contexts that I've been talking about. Yeah, question?
Does that mean you select them in the reverse order at the end?
Yes, essentially.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, does this mean you reverse them you select them in the reverse order of the priority? And the answer is essentially yes. And it doesn't mean it's the right way to do it, because you need to be thinking 3 columns ahead for which one you want to have whatever priority. Can be tricky, could be fine for trained users, terrible for brand new users. I'm not suggesting it's the best solution. But the nice thing about proposing something is people can very easily say, well, that's stupid. And that at least garners some feedback and some potential revisions. I just used the word feedback, which is good.
I just call it interesting.
Oh, okay, that's lovely. He just said he would call it interesting, because he's nicer than I am, which, I mean, to be fair, isn't hard, but yeah. So this is the part where I'm looking for feedback, for your feedback as authors and users, and I'm not necessarily asking for a heavy discussion here. I just want to give you these 3 overarching things. And you can think about it on your own time, or run it by your coworkers or users or whatever, and then come back and be like, also interesting. Anyway, the image I'm showing here is a metal frame. It's a 5x5 grid that has hooks and clips to hold paper, scissors, has a tray for glasses, a small bucket for pens. I wouldn't put pills in there. You'll never get them out. It's a good image, in my opinion, for tracking feedback, especially once you have the scissors. Now, for context, I am a member of the ARIA working group. So this group also has a hand in the accessible name calculation specification, and it also gives feedback on the ARIA authoring practices guide and works with the platform accessibility APIs. And all of this is to help determine how and what is exposed to end users and how it can be exposed to end users. So ideally, these efforts that the ARIA working group does makes their way into HTML, ideally. Typically, they don't necessarily do that, sadly. I'm saying all this because I want to qualify, I have this role, but I am not speaking on behalf of the ARIA working group. Most likely because they don't like it when I do that. So I'm going to focus on three things, and I'm going to walk through each of these in more detail. The first one is generating an accessible name from table headers. The second one is how not to be limited by the DOM, specifically the row role, or maybe the TR element. And the third one is operating and exposing multiple sorted columns, that thing we just discussed. But I'm going to save that for last because I did it this way. Okay, so accessible name from headers. I want your feedback in particular on whether column and row headers should be factored into the accessible name calculation, and if so, what risks you might see. The screenshot shows the APG data grid, example 2, the ARIA authoring practices guide, their data grid, second example. It has an input field, cache deposit, with an empty accessible name. So the field has the text in it already, cache deposit. No accessible name, no visible label, etc. There are buttons as well, but the names from those buttons are clear because they're written on the buttons. And then there's a pencil icon to edit that may or may not have an accessible name. I don't know for sure. So I have proposed some steps, and so far the group seems to be on board with this. So step one, first to identify if the field genuinely has no accessible name. And we can use the current accessible name calculation to identify, you've got no accessible name, problem. The second step would be identify if the field lives in a cell within a table or grid, because this is the structure we care about. The third step, if so, identify if that cell has a column and or row header. So column header and row header are the corresponding rows for that. And then finally, if it does have a header, use the value of each one of those separated by a space character. And step 2J goes into detail about that because holy crap, the space character really caused weeks of argument. And then make that concatenated thing or combined thing the accessible name for the field. So in my prior example, which apparently I can't go back to, there we go, that cache deposit field could have the accessible name of description 01 Jan 16 or 01 Jan 16 description. That could be the accessible name. That doesn't mean it's a good accessible name. And this isn't necessarily meant to be an ideal accessible name. The idea here is to provide something when the author has provided nothing. Have some sort of final fallback. Let's see if I have some other. So goals, provide guessable accessible names for voice users, because visible column headers and row headers. Provide accessible names for screen reader users who navigate by control. Provide accessible names for screen reader users who list all the controls. Avoid redundancy with column row header announcements for screen reader users who navigate via the table. And again, as I said, not meant to be perfect. It's meant to be a final fallback for users who've been provided nothing by authors. So if you have thoughts about it right now, I'd love to hear it. If you don't, that's okay too. I got more things to talk about. I see a thumbs up. You're waving, or is that a question?
Does the column header row header values default to a number? They're not, they don't have a value. My question is whether the column header and row header values default to a number if they are not, if they don't have a TH.
The column header and row headers, if there aren't any there, won't default to anything, but the screen reader will announce what position they are within the table. Column 1, row 2, for example, but those aren't their names.
I meant for your proposal for the,
Oh,
for the accessible name automatically, number 1 there.
if,
Extra fallback, I think, right? Point 3?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't, can you repeat the question?
So I'm saying if you're calculating the accessible name for, say, an input that does not have an accessible name, and there is a column header, but there's no row header,
Right?
then it will automatically say like row, it'll include the row number.
So the short answer is no, I didn't factor that in. And that's partly because we're trying to lean on content that is already there that can have been localized. That doesn't mean that's not a good idea, just means didn't factor that in. I'm glad this is being recorded, by the way, because I'm terrible at taking notes while also trying to think. Questions, thoughts, anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, so I had like a scenario where they wanted custom order of columns along with sort, and we were just deciding like where to put that, like custom ordering of columns versus sort buttons. Like, have you come across that, or like do you have any best practices to do with this?
Are you, so your question is not related to accessible names, correct?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can you sit on that until we get to the sorting? Because that might actually be a really novel and interesting angle I had not considered.
Okay.
Once I ask you follow-up questions.
Okay, sure.
All right, thank you. Any other thoughts on the accessible name? Yes.
Is this specific to fields, or would it include buttons as well?
It would include any control that warrants an accessible name that could be operated by the user.
Okay. The only thing I can think of, and it's probably just a bad design, but we once had a table where the last column was called actions, and then there were 3 buttons in it. One was like edit, one was delete, something else. And so I think those wouldn't be unique in that case because they would all have the same accessible name assigned. But again, it might just be a crappy table.
Yeah, so I see those all the time.
Okay.
And I might not like them, but those are also what I consider out of scope for what I'm trying to do here.
Okay.
And that's because we're trying to find controls that have no accessible name at all. I can't solve for controls that have crappy accessible names.
Oh, sorry, like if they don't already have accessible names?
Right.
They would all be called actions, right? Like if you have 3 buttons, they would be called,
If you have 3 buttons, yeah, oh, no, I see where you're going now. If you have 3 buttons, none of them has an accessible name because your author's a jerk. All 3 of them, yes, would absolutely just be called action.
okay.
And this is not meant to solve for that because this cannot fabricate a usable accessible name out of thin air. It's mostly to at least provide something, some minimal baseline.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
And for what I just want you to know that that's a great question because it was one of the first questions that we had to wrangle with as we tried to figure out how we're going to address this. And when I said, yeah, it's just going to suck, we're not going to solve for that, everyone was like, oh, well, that makes this easier. Any other questions on this one? All right. We're going to move on to the second one. Is row necessary? And when I'm saying row, I'm specifically talking about the row roll, which is fun to say in quick succession because roll, if we've been talking for an hour plus, sounds like I'm just barking. Roll. Anyway, DOM structures only group nodes via rows. That's just the way it is right now. There's no way to group a node in the DOM by column. There just isn't. CalGroup does not do it. CalGroup doesn't group anything. It's just a reference to a series of cells that happen to have the same ordinal position within a row. So the stated use case that somebody brought to the working group is scrollable columns, and it did not make sense to me what they wanted to do until I saw this example. Now this table has 15 columns, and the first 5 columns have their own horizontal scroll bar, and then the last 10 have their own horizontal scroll bar. The vertical scroll bar that you see there affects all of them at the same time, so that's not the concern. But it's really how can I sort a group of columns distinctly, how can I scroll a group of columns distinctly from another group of columns? And my first reaction was, well, that's silly, why would you want to do that? And of course, that's the wrong response for somebody who's genuinely trying to make an existing pattern as accessible as possible. So ARIA could do this today, potentially, assuming that the support exists in assistive technologies. But the problem with that is that excludes the option of HTML also having that same support. And I would like to see if there's a way we can make this happen that could maybe work its way into HTML. So you could use ARIA owns because grids, that would allow a grid cell to live outside of a row. And at this point, we're living fully in ARIA tables and grids. Like HTML tables are out the window for this one. We've just punted them. They can't handle this. But ARIA owns can help. But when I tested this, JAWS with Chrome was the only one that allowed table navigation within that structure, which meant the tables were useless for pretty much everybody else. NVDA and Firefox did not allow table navigation, and it also failed to convey some of the cell headers. And I'm still waiting from the person who filed this bug to understand if ARIA owns would satisfy their use case. But I'm also wondering, because I want to keep an eye on this being a thing in HTML, I'm wondering if the call group can be extended somehow in native HTML in some way to do this. Call group, however, has no ARIA equivalent. So I'm looking at a feature of ARIA that could maybe do it that has no HTML equivalent, wondering if there's a feature of HTML that has no ARIA equivalent that could do it, and arguably losing my marbles. So I don't know if anybody has ever seen this particular use case, has thoughts, has ideas on it, and if you don't, that's okay, but the good news is there is a GitHub issue where you can leave comments as well. But I'm open to thoughts, if anyone has any.
I have ADHD. I would not be able to read this table. I mean, I probably would be able if I really have to, but that would be a pain. And I would mention the engineers and designers in different courses. So I think that should not be allowed. Like, well, for example, VCAC, there is a failure if you, I mean, tables are excluded, but still we're kind of trying to avoid doubles, like two-directional scrolling, right? But in this case, it's kind of gets to the 4-dimensional scrolling because, okay, maybe 3-dimensional because you can scroll left and right side and then the vertical. And do you know when you were testing the NVDA in Firefox? Asking for a friend.
I'm sorry, about?
When did you test the NVDA in Firefox and that they didn't allow table navigation in the previous results? Basically what I wrote here, it didn't allow table navigation and it failed to convey some headers. I looked in the accessibility tree to understand what was going wrong, and then I realized I was going to be late, so I closed the tab and went and had lunch. Recently.
It was, yeah, this would have been 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
Or no, last week.
okay.
What year is this?
No, it was not 2020 like Mad Libs, right?
I'm sorry?
It was not 2020 like Mad Libs.
No.
Yeah.
No. This was the latest release of Firefox and maybe the latest point release of NVDA.
Thank you. I work for Firefox.
I know.
That's the
Yeah. And we can chat in some more detail afterward, but and there are demos as well. You can try out the demo linked from the GitHub issue. Now, to your point about telling people not to do this, I would also tell an author, hey, don't do this. But I also, as part of my role as a consultant, is not to say, don't do this. My role is to say, okay, you have a thing. Let's try to make it as accessible as possible. And that's partly because some users might be very familiar with this context. Okay, with this context. There might be trained users who only need a few minutes to understand conceptually how it works. I want to make sure that that thing that they're trained on or that they've experienced before is more accessible than it was. So yours is a valid point. it doesn't mean it's wrong, and it doesn't mean that I'm taking the right approach either. I'm just trying to find a path, which could end in tears for everybody and fire. Okay, otherwise I'll move on to the last one. Okay, you've all been so very patient as I'm mining you for information. Multi-column sort, we've come back to this. This is the last one where I wanted to get some feedback. Again, should be familiar, I just covered it. ARIA allows sorting on only one column at a time, arguably. It's a should statement, but there are obviously cases where authors want more than one. So I'm wondering here, I hate adding new attributes to ARIA. I've always wanted ARIA to shrink, have fewer things because HTML takes them up. So, do we look at doing a new attribute? Do we have ARIA sort order? Or does ARIA sort take a second value? Maybe it's, comma or space separated, whatever, like ascending space 1. And then on top of that, how would we as users expect that to be exposed? And I'm saying as users because I know DX is a thing that I often don't care about because we really are focusing on the user experience here. So the example that I pitched to the ARIA working group is the one that you saw before. So it's this table with 6 columns. The first 3 columns are sorted. The column headers of those first 3 columns have that offset circle with a number, and the arrows point either up or down to indicate ascending or descending. And it also shows that live region output from the sort operation. So in this case, when I activated the year column, which is that 3rd column, it announced, it said year, sorted down, author descending, priority 3, title ascending, priority 2. This was my verbose effort to attempt to convey all the sorted columns, how they are sorted, and what that priority is for sorting. It also means a lot of operating the buttons, like you had mentioned before, going in reverse order to get the correct columns with the correct orders and priorities. It might not make sense to the casual user. It could be fine for a trained user, though. So the questions come down to exposing it to users visually and programmatically, and then how they are operated. Things like modifier keys, yet more clicks, external triggers that live outside the table. And if you have experience with any software or libraries that do this, any feedback that you can offer, even in, it's a terrible idea. I'm interested in any feedback you have, and if you have none, that's okay too. I won't judge any more than I already have. Crap, I need to not say those things out loud. I'm terrible at this. So, thoughts, experience, if you wanted to restate or reframe the question you asked me before, and if it's an angle on this I just failed to consider.
No, it was just like a very unique.
Can you, yeah.
No, it was just like a very unique use case where we wanted to have like custom order of the columns along with like an in-column sort.
Mm-hmm. Did they want to reorder the columns, so move
Yeah.
them?
Yeah, so
Okay.
that like technically I could put title before author.
Yeah.
And
Now that's a model I've seen before, and I think that lives outside of this, but what interested me about where you were going with that, because that is a separate challenge and I don't want to dismiss it, but it's out of scope what I'm addressing here, except for okay, they want to also sort them. Does that mean they were sorting more than one column at a time?
oh no, they weren't sorting.
They were just reordering.
Yeah, just
Okay.
reordering the columns.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering about it. Do you have any best practices for that? Because you were just all over the place with it.
Well, yeah, you need to have left-right buttons and then, support multiple, right to left, vertical, et cetera, LTR, and the user needs to be able to start the table over. But that's, and again, I don't mean to be dismissive. I thought it might hook into the sorting question that I had here. Are there other questions or comments or thoughts about my multi-sort column effort experiment failure?
Can you go back to the first slide, please?
This one?
Yeah. When you mentioned the multi-column sort, I was thinking of how we can expose it to a user.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's something similar to like ARIA level for like when we do nested lists, etc.
Or heading levels?
Or heading levels, yeah. can you tell more about area sort order? How do you think it might be, I don't know, implemented?
I think that the ARIA sort order would essentially work the way I have these little numbers here. Because conveying it in any way other than a number, I'm not sure how much value that would bring to the user. Just where is it in that sort order? Is it the first priority, second, third? Unless you have another way of conveying that.
So there will be area sort order and outer area sort order equals 3, and then the screen reader will decide how they will announce it. Will they announce it?
Essentially, yeah.
That's
Okay.
that will be better than.
All right, I'm gonna do this thing where I'm reading the room right now as people are starting to pack. Does that mean the ice cream truck is here?
Yes.
Why do they do this to me? They did this to me yesterday. Okay, well, okay, so, yeah, that's it then. That's my talk. This closing image shows a small table against a shallow wall shelf unit rather, along with a rolly cart that I think they use as a mobile table. Anyway, I linked this, the slides before. Scan the QR code, rosel.li/tablesxsu. Post corrections or comments there. Follow the links. If you have praise you want to post, cool. Okay. Anyway, thank you for staying. I hope you enjoy your ice cream.
And do please fill out the survey. Do we have the link? Yeah. So we have the QR code for that. It's real quick. I think you've been doing them. Really important for Access U to get, keep improving. So thank you very much. And don't forget the sign out sheet for those of you in the room. If it, not sign out, you don't have to sign out. It's just an attendance sheet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.